On a freezing winter night outside the warm glow of harbor lights, a frail German shepherd stood silently before the misted glass. His amber eyes shimmered with a quiet longing, as if whispering a plea to be part of something more. While many turned away in discomfort, Robert, a young officer who had once walked through fire, froze at that gaze both proud and heartbreaking. He opened the door, placed his meal down, and in that moment a long-buried secret began to stir. No one could have imagined that this meeting would lead to a life-or-death journey and uncover a truth that left an entire town breathless. The east wind swept down the coastal street, carrying with it the dampness of a mist-covered lake. Faded yellow street lamps spilled their light across the patchy asphalt, their reflections flickering like trembling brushstrokes. And yet, in that gray and weary scene, the Harbor Lights restaurant glowed bright and warm, a beacon of comfort against the cold emptiness of the town at night. Robert sat alone at a table by the window. The coffee before him had long gone cold. The heat dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a faintly bitter scent. Outside, droplets of mist clung to the thick glass, turning the restaurant lights into shimmering fragments. He stirred his spoon absent-mindedly, eyes drifting far away. Coming here had become a quiet ritual, his way of avoiding the silence of an apartment overflowing with memories he was not ready to face. That was when a figure appeared beyond the glass. At first, just a blur of movement. Then, as his gaze focused, Robert's heart clenched. A German shepherd stood there. Its coat was ragged body so thin that every bone pressed against the skin. Each breath rose into the cold air like a wisp of smoke. But it was not the frailty that held Robert frozen. It was the eyes. Amber eyes glowing in the dark, carrying no threat, no aggression, only a quiet plea, a question buried deep within, "Can I eat with you?" In that instant, Robert felt as if time itself paused. Around him, cutlery clinked against porcelain, voices swelled in lively conversation, yet all of it faded to the background. The only thing that remained were those eyes meeting his through the misted glass. His hand trembled, as if that gaze had pierced through every defense he had built across the years. A couple at the next table frowned at the sight. The man tapped his knuckle sharply against the window to drive the dog away, while the woman whispered something with a look of distaste. A group of young men at the bar snickered, tossing out jeers about a mangy mutt begging for scraps. The laughter thickened the air with indifference, in sharp contrast to the fragile spark of hope flickering in the dog's eyes. Robert's grip tightened around the spoon. His mind carried him back to long nights as a firefighter standing before ruins, searching for survivors. He remembered eyes just like these, eyes that held despair and hope, at once fragile, yet fierce, begging for someone to step forward. Slowly, he set the spoon down. His coffee was stone cold, but inside his chest, a flame stirred to life. The dog's gaze didn't waver, as though the slightest turn away from Robert would extinguish its last hope. Leaning back in his chair, Robert studied the window. The dog's breath painted pale circles against the glass ears, slightly drooping eyes, steady, waiting. It was a small, still moment, yet it pressed against Robert's chest with a weight too heavy to ignore. Outside, the winter wind screamed across old rooftops, scattering brittle leaves against the pavement. Inside, golden light revealed the fine lines etched at the corners of Robert's eyes, the record of nights spent with loss unhealed. And he knew this night would not be like all the others, because beyond that glass a pair of eyes was quietly knocking at his heart. and Robert understood. It was time to rise. The clamor inside Harbor Lights carried on, but ever since the dog had appeared at the window, the air felt altered. Some guests shook their heads, whispering to one another, even cursing under their breath. Robert remained still, eyes locked on the thin figure outside, carrying the weight of its sorrow as if it were his own. "Sir, please close the curtain, that sight is disturbing." A middle-aged man spoke sharply. "That thing looks awful," a woman muttered at the next table. "Skin and bones, just loitering. Who lets it come near a restaurant like this?" The murmurs grew louder. A few of the young men at the bar banged their glasses and called out mockingly, "Hey, throw it a bone already. Maybe it'll leave us alone." Their laughter clashed with the soft jazz floating from the speakers, creating a dissonance that made Robert's chest tighten. He looked back at the eyes outside. The shepherd stood still, tilting its head slightly, gaze fixed, patient. There was no frenzy, no protest, only a quiet endurance, as though it had long grown used to rejection, yet still stood there waiting for a trace of kindness. Robert's hand shook against the table. He remembered again those rescues through fire and rubble, when the eyes of the trapped would ignite the strength for him to dive in. Argo's eyes, the dog's name now surfaced unbidden, were the same, silent yet pleading. A waiter approached, bowing slightly. "Sir, the dog is making our guests uncomfortable. Perhaps it would be best if you drew the curtain, or looked away." The words were gentle, but they were a dismissal nonetheless. Robert said nothing. He glanced at the steaming dish before him, rich with the scent of roasted meat. He lifted his fork, but his chest ached. This meal, he could have it any day. That dog outside, trembling with hunger, might lose its fragile hope the very moment he turned away. He rose to his feet. The scrape of his chair against the tiles sliced through the chatter, silencing the room. Dozens of eyes followed him as he walked toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. "Wait, what are you doing?" a customer blurted. "You're not letting it in, are you?" Robert turned his gaze unwavering. "If a life is waiting for me out there, why should I ignore it?" His words were soft, yet they filled the space like a sudden hush of wind. He opened the door. The cold rushed in, biting and raw. The shepherd flinched, ears pricking. Bathed in the restaurant's golden glow, it froze, caught between doubt and hope. Robert knelt, setting the plate on the step. "Come," he whispered, voice low and steady. Everyone braced for the obvious, for the dog to lunge desperate, tearing into the food. But Argo did not. He stepped forward slowly, pause unsteady, each movement tentative. His ears flicked with hesitation, his eyes darted back to Robert as though seeking permission. Only a few steps from the plate, he stopped. The restaurant held its breath. Then Argo sat down. His gaze stayed locked on Robert, waiting. Only when Robert nodded his eyes calm and gentle did the shepherd lower his head to eat. Each bite was small, deliberate, as if tempered by gratitude. No frenzy, no sound, but the quiet rhythm of breath. And in that silence, the room that had been so loud now felt like a place of reverence. A woman at a distant table raised her hand to her lips, her eyes misting over. The murmurs of mockery melted into silence. The entire restaurant, every glance, seemed to have been moved by that quiet dignity. Robert sat back down near the door, his arms resting lightly on his knees, his gaze following each movement with unshaken focus. His heart felt lighter, as if in that moment he had recovered a piece of meaning long lost through months of exhaustion. Outside, the wind kept blowing rattling dry leaves across the street. Yet inside that warm glow, A connection had been forged, not through words nor dramatic gestures, but through patience and respect. Argo ate slowly, his eyes lifting now and then to meet Robert's. An invisible thread was tightening, binding a man to a creature once thought forgotten. When the last bite was gone, Argo did not rise. He sat still, head tilted slightly, gaze steady, as if asking, "From this moment on, may I stay with you?" Robert let out a breath, and in that sigh lingered the faintest trace of a smile. He understood. His choice tonight had opened the door to a path unlike any before. And that journey had only just begun. The next morning, pale sunlight slipped through the curtains, painting faded streaks on the walls. Robert sat on a wooden chair, a steaming mug in his hand, his eyes resting on the corner of the room where Argo lay curled in sleep. The dog's breathing was deep. Even yet every subtle twitch of his body carried the air of discipline, like a soldier at rest between duties. Robert had noticed it since last night. Argo never devoured food like other strays. Each bite was slow, deliberate, as if following a rhythm drilled into him long ago. And when he entered the apartment, there was no frantic sniffing or restless pacing. Instead, every movement was measured, every glance composed, as though forged by countless hours of rigorous training. Robert's gaze darkened. He knew discipline did not appear from nowhere. It was etched over years through missions where survival depended on it. A stray could never carry itself in such a way. The thought clung to him all morning. After walking Argo along the lake, Robert decided to bring him to a nearby veterinary clinic. A suspicion had taken root, and if proven true, Argo's sudden appearance was far from simple chance. The clinic was quiet, the faint tang of antiseptic in the air. A nurse greeted him with a polite smile, her eyes lingering on the shepherd. "This one. He looks like he's been trained, don't you think?" Robert nodded. "That's exactly what I came to confirm. He asked for a microchip scan." When the device touched the back of Argo's neck, the dog shivered faintly, but did not resist. A single beep broke the silence, and the screen lit up with words that froze Robert in place. "Name Argo, Unit Special K-9 Division. Status deceased in line of duty recorded 3 years ago." Robert's breath caught. The word deceased burned into his vision. His pulse raced, air heavy in his lungs. He remembered fragments of a story from 3 years ago. An explosion at an industrial complex, a K-9 unit charging into danger to save hostages. Casualties were heavy. Among the dogs declared fallen, one name had stood out. Argo. The nurse tilted her head, voice hushed. Strange. If he was recorded as deceased, then how is he here alive? Robert stepped back, his eyes drawn to the shepherd. Argo sat quietly, amber eyes steady, as though he had heard and understood it all. No shock, no confusion. Only a stillness so profound it was almost ghostly, like a warrior who had walked out of fire and smoke. Robert left the clinic, clutching the printed record. The wind cut sharp against his face, yellow leaves spinning on the pavement. At his side, Argo walked with measured steps, posture straight, breath steady. Every motion bearing the bearing of a soldier who had never abandoned his rank. Robert's mind filled with images of a night engulfed in flames, a sky choking with black smoke sirens, wailing fire roaring like a living beast. He pictured Argo once charging into that inferno body, strong gaze unwavering, until an explosion buried everything in ash. How could he have survived? And why, after 3 long years, had he come back, appearing before Robert with that trembling gaze at the window? Robert stopped, lowering himself to a step along the street. His hand brushed over Argo's head through fur roughened by scars. Tiny ridges lined his body, long marks etched deep, each one proof that he had truly walked through fire and steel. Argo didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, pressing his head gently into Robert's palm. The gesture struck Robert's heart like a blade. Here sat a warrior, once declared lost, now alive before him. A living reminder that some stories do not end where the world believes they should. Robert knew this was no accident. If fate had brought Argo back then, a greater truth lay hidden beyond. The lake shimmered in the distance, sunlight breaking into silver fragments across its surface. Robert clenched the paper in his hand, a new light burning in his eyes. Shocked, yet resolute. The story was far from over. The truth was waiting. That evening his apartment lay in silence. A lamp spilled warm gold across a stack of untouched case files. Argo curled near the door, breathing slow and deep. The only sound was the clock's steady ticking, each beat marking time into the emptiness of Robert's thoughts. He sat, unmoving eyes drifting from the papers to the window, where the glow of the city faintly bled through. And then, as if a hidden door opened, memory swept him back into his past, dragging him into the flames he once called home. The image was seared into him, alarms piercing the night-black smoke, choking the street fire, raging like a beast devouring an old block of buildings. Robert had run with his unit into that inferno, lungs burning with every step. From the 3rd floor, a child's cries cut through the roar, forcing his heart into overdrive. He remembered Jack, his closest friend, slipping off his mask, forcing it onto the terrified child they had pulled from the smoke. That child had lived. Jack had not. The ceiling collapsed, fire swallowing everything. Robert never forgot the last scream of his friend as it vanished into the blaze. Since that night, his wound had never closed. He carried the guilt like a shadow, that he had walked out of the flames while Jack had not. Every mirror showed him the reflection of the one left behind. And so, he had left the fire department. He no longer had the strength to live with the flames, yet he couldn't abandon the calling to save lives. Becoming a police officer was his compromise, a way to keep rescuing, to claw back some piece of the debt he could never repay. But changing uniforms never meant healing. Every night Robert still woke, drenched in cold sweat, the fire roaring back in his dreams, Jack's last scream echoing in his mind. His eyes shifted toward Argo. The dog lay still sleeping quietly, yet his body carried a tension Robert recognized too well, like a soldier at rest, ready to rise at any moment. In the glow of the lamp, scars lined Argo's frame, each mark a memory of survival, mirrors of Robert's own hidden wounds carved deep and never fading. Robert exhaled softly, a sigh, weighted with something he could not name. He felt an inexplicable kinship. He was the firefighter left behind in the flames. Argo was the warrior who walked out of the blast. Both had stepped from darkness carrying scars seen and unseen. One man, one dog, 2 different fates tied by the same silence, the silence of survivors. He lowered himself to the floor, moving closer. Argo opened his eyes, amber burning faintly in the dark, steady on him. Robert laid a hand gently on his head, feeling the coarse fur beneath his palm. In that fragile moment, he sensed the presence of a warrior, a soul that had marched through fire, bearing both loss and pride. "You and I," Robert whispered, "we're more alike than I thought." Argo blinked slowly, then tilted his head into Robert's hand, an unspoken acknowledgement. Robert raised his gaze to the window. The night sky hung heavy with mist, streetlights blurred and faint. Yet inside his chest, something new was stirring. Not pity for a stray, but a connection as though fate itself had arranged for them to find one another. He knew this journey would not end with sharing a roof. Their wounds had led them here, and from that shared silence, a path waited ahead. Robert sat still, his hand resting on Argo's head, letting the warmth spread. And in that stillness, he understood. Both of them needed a reason to keep going, and perhaps they had just found it in each other's eyes. The small kitchen was lit only by the weak glow of a hanging lamp. Robert sat at the table dinner, untouched before him, while Argo lay close by. Usually after their walks, the shepherd would eat heartily, then curl up to sleep. But tonight was different. Robert had placed the bowl down long ago, the scent of meat still in the air, yet Argo had not touched it. His amber eyes were fixed on the window, taut as a drawn bowstring. Robert frowned. He knew this wasn't ordinary. A dog trained for canine work didn't break routine without cause. Argo's instincts were sounding an alarm, and that was something no man should ignore. Suddenly, Argo sprang to his feet. The fur along his spine, bristled ears, sharp gaze locked on the dark beyond the glass. A breath later, he lunged for the door, his body a streak of muscle cutting into the night. Argo Robert shouted, his chair toppling behind him as his heart hammered. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and ran after him. The streets were cold and deserted, the lake wind slicing damp and sharp. Ahead, Argo's shadow flickered under the sparse glow of street lamps, every stride decisive, as though chasing something already marked. The path led toward the lake, where mist lay thick across the water. The night pressed in, shrinking the world to footfalls and wind. Robert gasped for breath, but his eyes never left the shepherd's form, driven forward with unshakable purpose. At last, he slowed, finding Argo. Frozen body, taut ears, straining ahead. Robert narrowed his eyes, peering through the fog. And there it was. A warehouse, hunched and broken at the path's end. Rusted sheets glimmered under weak moonlight, shattered windows staring like hollow eyes. The air turned heavy, suffocating. A shiver clawed Robert's spine. He had walked into danger before, but rarely had instinct screamed so loud. As though in that darkness something waited, nameless, pressing, threatening. Argo stood locked on the warehouse fur-raised stance, grounded. His amber eyes blazed in the mist, a flicker of fire cutting the gloom. Robert stepped closer, hand resting on his back. The hard tension of muscle spoke volumes. Argo had sensed what Robert could not. The lake was still, yet the water's reflection rippled unnaturally, as if something had stirred it. The wind whistled through broken slats, boards rattling with dry, hollow knocks. A grim vision stirred in Robert's mind. An abandoned warehouse by the lake, shrouded in fog, and a canine standing guard with every nerve sharpened. This was no coincidence. His voice dropped, steady and low. "There's something in there, isn't there?" Argo growled deep and low, a sound that confirmed what words could not. Then he stepped forward, paws light, yet certain toward the rusted door. Robert swallowed hard, fists tightening. He knew he could not turn away. the world seemed to pause. Only the lapping of the lake and their breathing remained two beings braced before the threshold of a hidden truth. Robert's senses flared the familiar rush of dread before danger surging back from his firefighting days. Only now he was not alone. Beside him, Argo burned with readiness, eyes fixed, waiting to pierce the dark. Robert drew a long breath, his gaze pinned to the trembling sheet of rust before them. Inside, his fear twisted with curiosity, with a strange sense of destiny, an omen of a journey about to unfold. The darkness inside the warehouse seemed to beckon. The night mist thickened over the lake, cold breath seeping into Robert's collar. He stood still at the threshold, hand on the corroded frame. Beside him, Argo's ears twitched, his amber stare locked on the shadows, as though he could already see what Robert could not. And then it came. A sound. A frail sob, trembling, strangled, as if choked back in a tiny throat. Robert froze. His chest tightened. That cry was no illusion. It drifted from deep inside the warehouse, leaking through rotted gaps, striking his ears with the clarity of a plea for help. He took a step back, drawing in a long breath to steady himself. Years of rescues had made Robert familiar with cries for help, but this sound was different. Fragile, despairing, like a faint breath clinging desperately to life. He turned to Argo. The dog's body was rigid, head lowered, every muscle coiled, as if waiting for the command to strike. Robert knew a choice had to be made. The proper procedure would be to call for backup, to wait for support. But his instincts, sharpened by experience, screamed that every second lost could cost a life. In his mind's eye, he pictured the terrified face of a child locked in darkness, small hands trembling, eyes wide in panic. The vision sliced through him, dredging up memories of another child saved from a burning building, and of Jack, his friend, who had given up his mask, his life, to pass that breath of survival on. Robert clenched his fists. He couldn't turn away. Once again, fate was forcing him to choose between safety and action. "Let's go, Argo." His voice was hoarse but resolute. The warehouse door groaned as it swung open, rusty hinges shrieking like a warning. The stench of mildew and iron wafted out, heavy and suffocating. Inside, darkness pooled, broken only by pale shafts of moonlight, slipping through holes in the roof, falling like scars across the stained floor. Argo led silent and precise, a shadow gliding across the concrete. Robert followed close, his hand brushing the flashlight at his belt, though he didn't switch it on. Any sudden beam might give them away if danger lurked inside. Instead, he sharpened his ears, every sense stretched taut. The sobbing rose again, clearer this time, threaded with the faint clink of chains against stone. Robert's teeth ground together, heart thundering. He crept deeper, slipping past stacks of rotting crates and dust-cloaked tarps. Then he saw it. In the corner, huddled, small and trembling, was a child. Moonlight spilled through a shattered window, glinting on streaks of tears across her dirt-streaked face. Rope dug into her wrists, swollen from long hours of restraint. Her eyes, swollen from weeping, darted up to Robert and Argo. Astonishment flashing first, then despair, as if fearing that this too was a cruel illusion. Robert lifted a hand, palm open in reassurance, lips forming the words, "It's okay. I'm here." The girl whimpered, her voice cracked and broken, a raw plea for rescue. Argo crept closer, body low, amber eyes glowing like embers, urging courage into the child. Robert felt her quick, shallow breaths, her trembling frame pressed tight against fear. In that moment, all doubts vanished. This wasn't random. A child imprisoned in a lakefront warehouse alone in the night. There was darkness behind this far larger than they yet knew. But there was no time to weigh it. He dropped to one knee, fingers tugging at the coarse rope around her wrists. And then, a sound. Harsh metallic cutting through the silence. Heavy footsteps pounded across the wooden boards. Robert's head snapped up, veins pounding at his temples. Argo growled low and dangerous body surging forward, lips curling to bare teeth. The girl clutched at Robert's sleeve in terror. Robert pulled her close, shielding her with his arm, eyes narrowing toward the noise. His pulse hammered, but beneath it rose a steadiness he had not felt in years. He knew what he'd chosen. There would be no retreat. The warehouse thickened with menace, footsteps closing in. Darkness seemed to hold its breath, bracing for the clash. Robert's grip tightened around the child. Beside him, Argo's body, lowered muscles taut, amber eyes blazing, ready to strike. Pale moonlight bled through the broken window, cutting across the floor like slashes of silver. Robert's fingers worked the last knot, trembling when the sound erupted. Fast, pounding footsteps charged with violence. A figure burst from behind the crate's knife, raised steel flashing as it caught the moonlight in a deadly gleam. Robert reacted on instinct, twisting to cover the girl. The blade slashed past, ripping his shirt sleeve and carving fire down his arm. Blood spilled hot across his wrist. Pain darkened his vision, but he stood firm. The child screamed, eyes wide in terror. The knife arced again. Argo launched. His snarl tore through the warehouse, thunderous and commanding a storm-given voice. His body slammed into the attacker, the knife spinning from his grasp, clattering across concrete with a shriek. Robert dragged the girl to safety, cradling her against him. His arm burned, blood dripping, but his focus never wavered from the fight. The shepherd whirled, fur-bristling frame, low and powerful growls pounding like war drums. The assailant staggered up his face, twisted in the dim light, then lunged barehanded for the dog. In a blur, Argo struck. His jaws locked onto the man's arm, a grip like iron. The scream that followed pierced the air, shrill and desperate. Robert's teeth clenched, his heartbeat racing. Every second Argo held on was a second closer to survival. The girl trembled violently in his embrace, her tear-streaked eyes fixed on the battle as if watching life itself wrestle death. The man thrashed, striking Argo with savage blows, fists landing heavy against ribs and shoulders. The sounds echoed in the hollow space, dull and brutal. Yet Argo did not let go. His eyes blazed, body straining with all the strength and memory of a fighter who had stood unyielding before. Robert acted quickly. Dizzy with pain, he reached out with his foot, dragging the knife closer. With one hand, he pulled the girl farther behind him, while his gaze stayed locked on the chaos before him. And in that maelstrom of blood and noise, memories surged, flames, roaring comrades screaming Jack's sacrifice etched in fire. The old wound in Robert's heart flared, fierce and sharp. But this time, he wasn't alone. At his side was Argo, a warrior in another form, carrying the same spirit of defiance. And together, they stood unbroken against the dark. A sickening crack echoed through the warehouse, and the first attacker collapsed, his arm slick with blood. Argo held him pinned until the last of his fight drained away, then finally stepped back, snarling, positioning himself between Robert, the girl, and the danger that still lingered in the shadows. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood mingled with damp dust. Robert pulled the child to her feet, his voice trembling but firm as he whispered, "You're coming out with me. Trust me." The little girl nodded, clutching his hand tight. Tears still streaked her face, but in her eyes a spark of trust had begun to glimmer. Behind them, the man Argo had brought down lay groaning. Yet deeper in the dark, Robert caught it. Footsteps urgent and multiplied. The night was far from over. He glanced at Argo. Though streaked with blood, the dog stood tall, eyes locked forward, body taut, ready for whatever came next. Robert inhaled, tightened his grip on the child's hand, and gave the faintest nod. The storm of the night was not yet finished, and now 3 lives braced together at the edge of what lay ahead. The knife clattered across the concrete, shrieking as it spun under the pale moonlight that filtered through broken beams. In the same breath, Argo's snarl split the silence, raw, thunderous tearing through the warehouse. His body slammed the thug to the ground, muscles rippling as he drove the fight into the floor. The man thrashed wildly, fists pounding into Argo's ribs, but the shepherd only bit down harder, jaws clamped like steel. Blood seeped into his golden sable coat, the sharp tang choking the air. The struggle, the grunts, the shouts, all hammered against Robert's heart like war drums. He clenched his teeth, cradling the girl against him, dragging her out of the death-shadowed corner. His wounded arm dripped hot blood down his sleeve, dizziness creeping at the edge of his vision. Still, his eyes stayed locked on the faint outline of the exit. The child trembled violently, her small fingers twisting his shirt with desperate force, her gaze wide and horrified. The thug's screams rang out, drowned beneath Argo's feral roar. In that moment, the dog was no longer a stray, but a soldier. His body pressed low muscles drawn to breaking point, every fiber focused on one unshakable vow: to shield Robert and the girl, no matter the cost. Robert edged them closer to the door, heart pounding hard enough to break his chest. But as they neared the faint glow of the outside, a chill swept down his neck. His instincts flared. He turned, and out of the dark stepped another figure. The second man was larger, built of muscle eyes gleaming like a predator's. In his grip, a long blade gleamed white under the fractured moonlight. He moved from the shadows with slow, heavy steps, lips curling in a cruel grin, as if certain he had cornered his prey. Robert shoved the girl behind him, eyes sharp with dread. He knew this nightmare was only deepening. Blood ran down his arm in steady streams, but his stance was firm, his body a shield. Behind him, Argo still held the first man down. The shepherd's body trembled under the force of the struggle, yet his eyes flicked between Robert and the child, a low growl vibrating like a warning bell. The second man sneered, tightening his grip on the knife as he closed in. His boots thundered against the floor, each step a hammer beat in Robert's chest. The night thickened, wind howling through the broken seams, carrying the stench of blood and rust. Robert bent to the girl, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Stay calm. We'll get through this." The child nodded, tears glittering, but in her eyes burned a faint flame of hope. That look struck something inside Robert, fueling his resolve. Between life and death, Robert's gaze met Argo's. In a single moment, they understood. This fight was the line between despair and salvation, and they would see it through together. A growl rose deep and resonant, echoing off the rusted walls. The knife flashed in the air as the brute surged forward. Robert clenched his jaw, pain and blood mingling, but his grip tightened, ready. Then it came. The collision. The man lunged, knife slicing the air toward them. Robert braced, but Argo broke free from his hold, hurling himself forward like a living spear. The blade veered off course, not striking Robert nor the girl, but cutting into Argo's shoulder. A splash of crimson burst across his golden coat. Robert's eyes widened in horror, but Argo did not falter. With a roar, he twisted, dragging the man into the wall. Dust exploded, steel groaned. The shepherd's growl shook the warehouse, relentless and commanding, echoing from every surface. Blood spilled down his side, but his eyes burned with unbroken fire. His jaws locked onto the attacker's arm, anchoring like iron. Robert clutched the girl close, shielding her small frame. She quivered like a leaf in a storm, her fists gripping his shirt until her knuckles turned white. He whispered against her ear, steady and fierce. "Easy. I'm here." It was more than comfort. It was a vow. His wound throbbed the air, thick with rust and mold, but he stood firm. The girl was hope. Argo was the shield. The brute howled, thrashing the knife, clattering to the floor. Blood poured down his arm, mixing with Argo's, spreading in chaotic streaks across the cement. And then, the first man stirred. Groaning, staggering hatred sparking in his eyes, he began to rise again from the ground. Robert summoned the last of his strength and kicked hard at the thug. The blow didn't finish him, but it was enough to send him sprawling backward. His eyes locked with Argo's. Just a fleeting glance, yet filled with perfect understanding. Those amber eyes spoke clearly, "I'll hold him. Protect the child." The air shook with the clash of sound, their ragged breathing, the scuffle of bodies, the wind seeping through the cracked walls. Blood streamed from Argo's shoulder, bright red, burning against the dark like fire in the night. Yet every move was steady, drawn from a reservoir of faith, deeper than pain. Robert clutched the little girl close, turning toward the door. But the iron slab was locked tight, only a sliver of moonlight breaking through the gap. Footsteps echoed from beyond, urgent, multiplying. Whether rescue or more danger, he could not know. Time slowed to a knife's edge. Robert felt the girl's frantic heartbeat against his chest, heard Argo's strained breaths as he held his ground, and knew they were standing on the line between life and death. Argo, bleeding and battered, poured all his strength into keeping the enemy pinned. His jaws locked, deeper eyes burning like embers in the mist. He would not yield, for behind him stood Robert the child and the fragile hope they carried. The image seared itself into Robert's mind, a dog once abandoned, declared dead, years ago, now standing in the dark, bloodied, but blazing, as a living symbol of courage. The warehouse thundered with screams, snarls, the clatter of metal against stone. Darkness pressed in, eager to swallow them whole, but in the center burned defiance brighter than fear. Robert gritted his teeth, his arms tightening around the girl, his gaze fixed on the faint slit of light at the door. They had to escape. But first, Argo had to survive this crucible. Deep down, Robert believed he would. The stench of mold and blood thickened, clogging the lungs. Robert swept the shadows with his eyes, every sense straining. Ahead, Argo wrestled the wounded thug, his own shoulder drenched scarlet, yet his stare held steady, unbroken. Then came the sound, footsteps from the far corner. Cold, measured, and 3 more figures emerged. Each carried a rusted iron bar, metal glinting under stray threads of moonlight. The leader, gaunt face, twisting with a crooked grin, hissed through his teeth. "Well, well, a cop trapped in our den, and a crippled dog in the way." The girl burst into sobs, her small body shaking in Robert's arms. The sound pierced him like a blade. He bent his head close, whispering rough but steady, "Don't be afraid. I'll get you out." But he knew the truth. This was no simple fight. Wounded, burdened with a child, and now surrounded, every moment brought the walls closer. Argo stepped forward, massive frame blood-soaked, yet proud. His fur bristled, his amber eyes flared like torches. He lowered his stance muscles taut, prepared to throw himself once more into the storm. The leader raised his weapon, closing in. Robert backed against the wall, pressing the girl behind him, eyes darting, calculating. Calling for help was useless. The door was barred and the circle was closing. The first thug swung. Robert dodged, barely, the iron rod hissing past his ear. Before he could recover, Argo exploded forward, his roar shaking the rafters. He slammed into the man's chest, hurling him back, the weapon clattering across the floor. But the other two struck. A bar cracked hard against Argo's back, the dull thud reverberating. Robert roared, seizing a rotted plank from the ground and swinging with all his might. The wood shattered on impact, but it staggered the thug, buying a moment. Chaos erupted. The girl sobbed into Robert's shirt, the sound of her cries a haunting refrain amid the violence. Robert shielded her, his body and mind stretched to breaking. Argo blood soaking his fur still fought on. He spun, clamping his jaws onto another attacker's wrist. Metal clanged to the floor once again, screams splitting the air. Robert dragged the child a few steps closer to the door toward the faint moonlit crack. Each step was a battle, his wounded arm burning his legs heavy under the weight of responsibility. He glanced back. Argo was still locked in combat, body quaking, but eyes never leaving his enemies. The leader had risen, rage twisting his face. He gripped the iron bar again, stalking forward, malice burning in his gaze. His weapon gleamed, cold, raised high. Robert braced himself. He wrapped both arms around the girl, ready to take the blow if he must. His heart hammered each second, stretching into eternity. This was the end of their line. The iron swung down, and then piercing the night, a sound split the chaos. The wail of a police siren. It blasted through the warehouse walls, echoing like the voice of salvation. In that instant, the attackers froze, hesitation flashing across their eyes. Harsh white beams slashed through the gaps in the door. The iron entrance burst open, dust scattering as floodlights and flashlights stormed the dark. Boots thundered against the floor. Shouts filled the air, police. "Drop your weapons," and for the first time that night, hope roared louder than fear. The gang leader twisted around his contorted face, crumbling into raw fear. He tried to bolt, but Argo lunged with the last of his strength, pinning him against the cement floor. Blood dripped steadily from the shepherd's wounded shoulder, yet his jaws locked tighter on the man's wrist, until the iron bar clattered away in defeat. Before the others could react, harsh beams of flashlights cut across the gloom. Police weapons leveled in an instant, forcing the thugs into submission, hands trembling in the air. Robert clung to the little girl, vision blurred by sweat and dust. Outside, sirens still howled, but within him stretched a heavy silence carved from the weight of what they had just survived. His whole body shook not from fear, but from the aftershock of standing on the knife's edge of life and death. A young officer rushed forward, carefully lifting the child from Robert's arms. She cried uncontrollably, her tiny fingers clutching at his shirt, until Robert leaned down, whispering gently, and only then did she let go. Her tearful eyes shimmered in the beam of a flashlight, a fragile mixture of terror and hope. "We'll take her somewhere safe," the officer promised, his voice firm, but softened for the child's ears. Behind them, iron cuffs clinked as the criminals were chained. One by one, they were dragged out the light, exposing their twisted, filthy faces, their glares hollow with powerless rage. Then the doors of hidden compartments inside the warehouse were thrown open, and the horror deepened. Dozens of small figures emerged. Children gaunt and trembling, wide-eyed with fear, many with wrists still bound. The rescue team froze, breath stolen by the sight. The cruelty laid bare in that moment pierced everyone present. Another officer shouted for medics cutting ropes, guiding the children out. Their cries filled the night. Calls for mothers, fathers. An agonizing chorus breaking the darkness apart. Robert leaned back against the wall chest, heaving the wound in his arm, searing hot. He looked up and found Argo. The dog stood trembling, his coat soaked crimson breath, ragged and shallow, yet his amber eyes still burned bright. Robert crossed the room, dropping to his knees. His hand shaking brushed the shepherd's head. "Good boy, you did it," he whispered, voice breaking. Argo met his gaze with that strange, unspoken understanding, as if both knew this was more than a fight, more than duty. It was destiny. Dust still hung thick flashlights, cutting sharp lines through the haze. Robert and Argo sat opposite each other in that moment, battered and blood-stained, yet alive. Their breaths came heavy, but in their eyes burned the fragile, undeniable light of survival. Outside ambulances joined the chorus of sirens, blue and red, flashing across the night, declaring that truth had been revealed, and justice had arrived. Robert turned, watching, as children were led away step by step toward safety. His fist clenched, his heart aching with grief and gratitude. He knew, without Argo, this night would have drowned in darkness. Argo groaned softly, collapsing to the floor. Robert instantly gathered him into his arms, pressing the dog close, whispering like a vow, "I won't let you fall." In the chaos, lit by rescue lights, one man and one German shepherd sat together, breathing hard through smoke and blood. The battle's fury condensed into this single silence, the beginning of a new path, one of healing and of reckoning with the scars they carried. The warehouse still reeked of rust smoke and dust, but the storm had broken. Outside, the red and blue glow painted the crumbling walls, casting the ruin in new colors, the colors of truth. In a corner, Robert cradled the girl again. Her face was streaked with tears and grime, her body trembling with the weight of too many nights in darkness. Yet as her head pressed against his chest, her breathing steadied. He felt the quick pulse of her heart beneath his hand, and his calloused fingers, once hardened by fire, curved around her like a shield. Beside him, Argo lay, battered blood clinging to his fur, yet his gaze never wavered. Each breath was labored, chest rising and falling in painful waves, but his eyes tracked Robert and the child, ensuring they were safe. Robert met that gaze, and in it saw loyalty, courage, and love beyond words. "You did well," Robert murmured, stroking the matted fur. Argo closed his eyes, not in surrender, but as if to rest in the comfort of that touch. The girl shifted her tiny hand, clutching at Robert's sleeve. I'm scared," she whispered, voice raw. Robert bent low, answering softly. "You're safe now. You have me and you have Argo. No one will hurt you again." The words were a promise, fragile, yet unbreakable. The child lifted her tearful gaze toward Argo, reaching a trembling hand to his bloodied fur. The shepherd turned eyes gentling, and with effort his tongue brushed her hand in a quiet gesture of reassurance. The child broke sobbing as she flung her arms around his neck. Robert watched a warmth stirring through the ashes inside him. He had lived too long in smoke and fire, seen too much death. But this moment proved life could still be rekindled in the smallest of gestures, a touch, a look, an embrace. he gathered them both, one wounded child, one scarred warrior, into his arms. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of loss shift into the fragile strength of belonging. Heavy footsteps approached, voices sharp. "Robert, we need to get all three of you out now." He nodded faintly, tightening his hold. Outside, the night was still cold, but floodlights pushed the darkness back. Robert carried the girl into the open Argo, limping close behind, blood trailing from his wound, but eyes fixed on them with unyielding fire. Neighbors gathered, whispering in shock. They saw a rescued child in a man's arms, and beside them a German shepherd drenched in blood, yet standing proud. That image etched itself into the memory of all who witnessed it, an image of courage, sacrifice, and the unshakable bond between man-child and dog. The little girl was still nestled against Robert's chest, but her tiny hand had stopped trembling. She whispered so softly that only Robert and Argo could hear, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but Robert felt his chest tighten, as if all the heaviness he had carried for years had been washed clean by the innocence of that gratitude. He glanced at Argo and caught the quiet pride glowing in those amber eyes. A man, a child, and a dog. 3 fragile lives that had once seemed scattered, now bound together by an invisible thread, the thread of survival. The wail of ambulances rose again, no longer a distant sound of dread, but a heartbeat in rhythm with this moment. Robert knew their journey wasn't over. Wounds still needed healing, memories still demanded soothing, and trials lay ahead. But he also knew that from this moment on, they belonged to one another. Night draped the city in heavy shadows, broken only by streetlights, and the urgent cry of sirens tearing through the dark. At the central hospital, white light flooded endless corridors, echoing with the hurried steps of doctors and the hum of machines. Robert sat on a cold plastic chair, his left arm wrapped in thick bandages throbbing with every small movement, yet the pain in his body was nothing compared to the ache in his chest. In the room next door, Argo was under emergency care. Though the door was closed, Robert could hear the shuffle of feet, the clink of metal tools, the hurried voices of the vets. His mind kept replaying the moment Argo hurled himself between Robert and the blade, the way his blood stained golden fur, the way his eyes never left Robert and the child. That image burned into him, painful, yet carrying a strange fire, the fire of a bond that could never be undone. A nurse stepped out, voice gentle. "Officer Robert, you can see him for a moment. Please keep quiet. He needs rest." Robert nodded, his pulse pounding as though he were walking into battle again. The door opened. The sharp scent of antiseptic hit him, white light spilling across stainless steel. There on the table lay Argo, motionless, his massive frame bound in white gauze. His once proud coat was ragged, matted with dried blood. But what cut deepest into Robert's chest was the slow, heavy rise and fall of his breathing, his eyes closed, as if lost far away. Robert stepped closer, hand trembling as it brushed over the tangled fur. "My friend." His voice cracked into a breath. In that moment, he felt himself hurled back years to the day his partner had fallen in the fire. That day, he hadn't been able to hold on to a hand. He could only watch as flames swallowed everything. That helplessness had haunted him ever since. But tonight, he swore it would not happen again. He lowered himself, gripping Argo's paw, the large, scarred paw that had once carried him through battles unknown. "Sleep, but wake again." "I need you," Robert whispered, voice trembling. The words were less a plea than a vow, a lifeline cast between two souls who should never have met, but were now tied together in the crucible of life and death. His grip tightened as though trying to pour warmth and faith into Argo. And then, strangely miraculously, the shepherd's paw twitched. Just a flicker, but enough. Robert froze, tears stinging his eyes. He bent lower, whispering again, "From now on, you'll never be alone. Wherever you go, whatever comes, I'll be there." Outside the window, a thin moon spilled light across sterile tiles. The night seemed endless, but in that cold hospital room, Robert felt something warm grow in his chest. Not just empathy, but a bond of two lost souls who had finally found each other in the dark. He sat there for hours, never leaving Argo's side. Doctors came and went, urging him to rest, but he only shook his head. His eyes followed every fragile breath, guarding it like a flame in the wind. Outside, sirens still rose and fell, but inside this room, time itself seemed to stand still. Near dawn, the first pale light crept through the window. Robert hadn't moved his hand, still wrapped around Argo's paw. A new day had begun, but this night soaked in blood and tears would forever mark his life. A night of pain, yes, but also the night of a silent promise. That morning, after only a brief, restless doze, Robert was startled awake by the buzz of his phone. Messages crowded the screen, from colleagues, friends, even strangers. They all carried one name, Argo. He flicked on the TV. The morning news was live. The anchor's face was solemn, but her eyes gleamed. A major human trafficking ring was dismantled last night, thanks to the bravery of a police officer, and a German shepherd. What shocked investigators is that this dog named Argo was recorded as having died in an explosion 3 years ago. The screen shifted to footage Argo on a veterinary stretcher shoulder, wrapped in white bandages. Even injured, his eyes glowed sharp in the dark of that warehouse. The image froze, replayed, magnified. A symbol of loyalty of survival against all odds. A bold caption ran beneath Argo, the hero who returned from the dead. Robert sat motionless. He had known the story would spread, but not this fast. Overnight, Argo's image had filled newspapers, TV broadcasts, social media. Photos of Argo resting his head in Robert's hand at the hospital were everywhere. Eyes closed, exhausted, yet still bound by an unbreakable trust. Comments surged beneath every article. How did this dog survive 3 years? Why was a hero left to wander the streets starving? Who failed him? A knock broke his thoughts. A young reporter stepped inside. Slim frame hunched over a recorder. Her voice was quick, charged with both urgency and awe. "Officer Robert, you were the first person Argo trusted. Tell us, where has he been these 3 years? Who is responsible for letting a decorated hero, once celebrated, end up abandoned on the streets?" Robert froze. His mind flooded with the memory of harbor lights that first night. The shepherd's gaunt figure in the cold, those amber eyes pressed to the glass, silently begging not just for food, but for trust. He couldn't answer immediately. His chest tightened with the weight of it because he knew. The reporter's question wasn't only about Argo's past. It was an accusation against an entire system, against all those who had praised, then forgotten. Over the next few days, the press dug deeper. Old files resurfaced, reports from 3 years ago replayed. They painted Argo as the fallen hero, the dog who had rushed into smoke and fire, who saved lives in the blast, then vanished in the chaos. A name once carved into the list of the dead was now walking again, flesh and blood, scars still fresh. The revelation shook the public. Outrage, grief, and awe spread like wildfire. Robert watched it all whirl across his phone screen. He realized something painful, yet undeniable. Argo would no longer belong to just him. His companion's image had become a story for the world, an emblem of loyalty, but also a mirror reflecting society's cruelty of remembering with praise, then forgetting with silence. Yet behind all the noise, Robert saw only one truth. Argo needed peace, a home, and someone who would never let go. That afternoon, sunlight poured through the hospital window as Robert sat beside the veterinary bed. Argo was awake now, still weary, but his eyes brightened when they met Robert's. Robert laid a hand on his head, stroking down gently along his neck. "They're calling you the hero who came back," he whispered. "But to me, you're not a symbol, not a headline. You're my partner, a life I promised I'd keep beside me." Argo's eyes softened. He let out a slow breath, tail thumping faintly against the thin blanket. Robert smiled, a rare smile in the storm. Beyond these walls, the world buzzed with Argo's name. But here in this quiet room, only one bond mattered, silent and unbreakable. That evening, the sky grew heavy gray clouds blanketing the small town. Robert sat in a roadside cafe, waiting for someone important, a retired canine handler who had once fought beside Argo. The man entered with a weary gait, hair-streaked silver eyes carrying the weight of memories that refused to fade. His name was Samuel. When their eyes met, Samuel nodded. But the moment he saw Argo by Robert's side, he froze. His hands trembled, his breath caught. Argo, though still healing, rose slowly, stepping toward him. Their gazes locked, long, unbroken, as though they were peering back into the same past. Samuel's voice cracked a whisper, trembling on his lips. "Dear God, Argo, you're alive." Robert stayed quiet, watching. For a moment, the grizzled veteran before him wasn't a retiree, but a witness to tragedy reborn. He sat down, voice slow, heavy with remembrance. 3 years ago, when the blast hit, we were told workers were trapped in the basement. Smoke choked the air, fire raged, and men hesitated. But not Argo. He went in without pause, leading people through the flames, barking the way forward. I still see him grabbing a boy's sleeve, dragging him out of the fire. They lived because of him. Samuel faltered, drawing a long breath, eyes shining with restrained tears. Then another explosion ripped through. I was thrown down, and I saw Argo swallowed by fire and rubble. We never found him. Everyone believed he'd died a hero. We held a funeral. We saluted him as one of our own. Robert's chest tightened, breath heavy. He could picture it through Samuel's words. The chaos, the screams, and a silhouette charging into fire without hesitation. The old man leaned back, voice breaking into a low murmur. I cried like a child that day. I thought I'd lost a comrade, a symbol. And now, he's here. Alive. This is nothing short of a miracle. Argo sat by Robert's chair, amber eyes fixed on Samuel as though he understood every word. His tail swayed gently, faint but sure, like a quiet acknowledgement. Silence settled in the cafe. Samuel reached out, trembling hand resting on Argo's head. You're still the same. Still burning with that fire. But where have you been all this time? How did you survive?" Robert said nothing. He had no answers himself. All he knew was that Argo's return carried more than a miracle. It carried secrets still buried in ash. Samuel's hands clenched around his cup. His voice grew firm. "Robert, you're lucky. Out of everyone, Argo chose you. Don't forget, he was once a warrior, a hero. Don't let this miracle be forgotten again." Robert nodded, emotion swelling in his chest. He turned to Argo, seeing not only survival in his gaze, but the scars of a past untold. He knew the journey wasn't over. Argo's return was a key unlocking stories long buried. Beyond the cafe window, the sky burned crimson in twilight, casting their silhouettes across the worn wooden table. The past had just been unearthed, and with it, a path toward truths still waiting in the dark. Robert's small apartment sat at the end of a maple-lined street where morning light often slipped through the window and stretched across warm wooden floors. For years, silence had been his only companion. White walls and old sofa shelves coated in dust. But today, as Robert unlocked the door and Argo's paws clicked softly behind him, a new breath of life entered the space. Argo moved slowly through each corner, nose tracing the air as if memorizing every scent of this new home. His coat still bore dried blood, but his eyes shone sharp alert. Robert set down a metal bowl, filled it with water, and laid out food rich with aroma. Then he stepped back. Argo didn't rush forward like a starving stray. He sat eyes steady on Robert, waiting. That discipline, that dignity, tightened Robert's chest. He gave a small nod, and only then did Argo lower his head, eating slowly each bite, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Robert sat beside him, hand resting gently on his back, warmth pulsing through his palm. For the first time in years, the apartment no longer felt empty. The next morning, a knock sounded at the door. Robert opened it to find the little girl, the one he had carried from the warehouse. She stood there with a social worker hair unkempt, half-shadowing her round, uncertain eyes. Robert crouched to her level, a faint smile softening his tired face. "You came to see Argo, didn't you?" The little girl nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. The social worker explained softly that she had clung to the memory of the dog who saved her, and seeing him again might help calm her heart. Robert turned his head, and there was Argo standing silently behind him, as if he had already known this moment was coming. The instant her eyes met his, the girl darted forward, wrapping her thin arms around the shepherd's neck. Argo didn't flinch, didn't stiffen. He simply lowered his head, offering the weight of his body for her small embrace. From the child's chest came a trembling exhale, as though all her fear had found a place to melt away. Robert watched, and his own eyes burned warm. From that day, the apartment, once filled only with silence, carried new sounds, soft laughter, small footsteps trailing through the hallway, the faint scratch of pencil as the girl sketched Argo on sheets of paper. In the afternoons, Robert let her stay, sharing the care of the shepherd, as though the three of them had always been meant to find each other. Some evenings, Robert simmered a pot of soup in the kitchen, setting 3 bowls on the table, one for himself, one for the girl, and a separate dish for Argo. They gathered under the warm glow of the hanging lamp, a simple sight, but one with the quiet power to heal. After eating, Argo would curl beneath the table, amber eyes shimmering as he kept watch over the fragile peace they were building. Robert noticed how the girl began speaking more. At first her words came haltingly, but slowly, full sentences returned. "He's like a hero," she whispered one night, her hand stroking Argo's back. When I was trapped, I thought no one would find me. But his eyes, they were like light in the dark." Robert said nothing. He knew those words captured exactly what he himself had felt that first night, when he saw Argo through the restaurant window at Harbor Lights. Eyes that could pull a soul back from the brink, eyes that reminded you life was still worth holding on to. At night, after the girl had been taken back to the shelter, Robert sat in the lamplight with Argo's head resting on his lap. "This house isn't cold anymore," he whispered. The shepherd's tail thumped softly, ears flicking, as if he understood every word. Outside, the wind rustled through the maples. Inside, a once-empty home, filled with warmth and connection. 3 lives once scattered, now bound together into a family. Mornings settled into rhythm, the girl's light footsteps in the kitchen, the gentle clatter of Robert's spoon against a pot of soup, and Argo's steady breathing on the floor, ears twitching at every sound. His amber eyes never strayed far from the 2 he had chosen as his own. Robert soon realized it was more than training. It was a vow. In Argo's gaze lived an unspoken promise. Every time Robert set down a meal, Argo looked to him first, waiting for a nod, then ate in calm dignity. It wasn't obedience. It was trust. The girl gave Argo a name of her own, the Guardian. Whenever she laughed, his eyes lit up as if echoing her joy. Whenever she grew quiet or afraid, he pressed his heavy head into her lap, giving her warmth until her small hands stopped trembling. One afternoon, she whispered to Robert, "He looks like he's saying, 'Don't worry, I'm here.'" And Robert, glancing at the shepherd's steady gaze, knew she was right. Their meals together became threads weaving the 3 of them tighter. Robert would slip Argo a piece of meat, only to see the girl sneak another, as though proving love was best shown in action. Sometimes under the amber glow of the lamp, Robert reached across to hold the girl's tiny hand, once clenched in fear, now resting trustfully in his. She had 2 guardians now, one in uniform, one in a coat of golden fur. At night, Robert sat by the window, city lights spilling across the streets below, while Argo lay at his feet, eyes ever watchful. Silence no longer meant loneliness. It was strength shared between 2 survivors. One evening, the girl dozed off on the couch blanket slipping from her shoulders. Robert tucked it gently around her and turned to see Argo watching too, eyes glinting beneath the lamp. "She was given to us, wasn't she?" Robert murmured. Argo's tail stirred, then he lowered his head beside the child, as if in silent agreement. Each small moment, a look, a touch, a breath, wove them into something whole. Robert was no longer lost, the girl, no longer trembling, and Argo no longer wandering the streets like a ghost. They were family. Outside, winter was fading, buds swelling on the maple branches. Inside, Argo's eyes never left the 2 he guarded. In them burned loyalty, a new beginning, and a journey not yet complete. That day, the sky stretched blue and clear, sunlight spilling golden across the square where a memorial ceremony was held. Flags whipped in the wind, rows of chairs filled with families, old comrades, and the children once pulled from danger. The air was solemn, yet alive with memory, as if each gust carried whispers of the fallen. Robert stood in full uniform, his injured arm still bound, his eyes grave, but shining with quiet emotion. Beside him, Argo walked proudly, freshly groomed. His coat, once matted with blood and ash, gleamed under the sun, and his amber eyes blazed with pride. Each step was steady, strong, less a dog's gait than the march of a soldier. As the announcer's voice rose, calling out the names of those who had fallen in the explosion 3 years ago, the entire square sank into silence. The wind brushed through, carrying with it petals from white wreaths that drifted down like a gentle rain. Among the names read aloud were Robert's old comrades, the canine partners who had once fought beside him. And then came the name Argo, a name once thought to rest forever in peace. The syllables rang across the plaza, and in that moment, as Robert led Argo up onto the stage, the crowd rose to their feet as one. Time seemed to halt. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the German shepherd, his coat gleaming in the sunlight, his stance proud and regal. Each step he took radiated resilience. To those watching, it was as though a symbol had walked out of the shadows itself, carrying not only his own survival, but the fragile ember of hope and faith for everyone present. Robert bowed his head respectfully to the audience, then knelt beside Argo, laying a hand on his shoulder. He spoke no words, for none were needed. The way Argo stood tall, silent, and unwavering was its own testimony. His eyes reflected everything: loss, pain, and the unyielding strength to walk through darkness and emerge whole. Applause thundered across the square, echoing like waves rolling on and on. Old comrades stepped forward, men and women who had once believed Argo had died in duty. Their hands trembled as they touched his fur, tears streaming as they whispered, "The hero has returned." One man embraced Robert, murmuring gratitude for bringing him back from the forgotten. And then the little girl, once trapped in that cold warehouse, ran to the shepherd's arms wrapped tight around his neck, her eyes glowing with joy instead of fear. On the stage, the commander fastened a silver medal onto Argo's new collar. The glint of metal caught the sunlight, engraving his name into history. It was proof that no sacrifice is wasted, that even the quietest warriors deserve to be honored. Robert tightened his grip on the lead, his chest swelling with pride, gratitude, and the relief of seeing a story once dark close now in brilliance. The host's voice closed the ceremony. Argo is not just a canine. Argo is the embodiment of loyalty, resilience, and a living reminder that even when darkness seems absolute, light can return. The applause surged again, blending with the wind and distant church bells, as if an anthem was being played for the silent heroes of the world. When Robert and Argo stepped down from the platform, the applause still trailed after them. Robert bent low and whispered, "You're not alone anymore. We came back together." Argo tilted his head. Amber eyes locked on him, tail brushing lightly against his leg as if in agreement. That image of a shepherd once thought lost, now honored as a warrior reborn, sealed the day. And within that honor lay a promise. A new journey awaited, full of trials, yet untold, but brimming with hope. Dawn spread pale pink across the lake, the surface rippling gently with golden light. The air was so still that every bird call rang crisp and clear, mingling with the scent of grass wet with morning dew. Robert drove slowly along the familiar road, the one that had led him into the night of shadows, the road where it had all begun. In the back seat, the girl leaned her head against the glass eyes, tracing the passing trees, while Argo lay beside her, occasionally glancing over his gaze, steady and watchful like a guardian's. When the car stopped, Robert stepped out, inhaling deeply. Before him lay the same lake that had once been drenched in fear, where cries of terror had filled the night. But now it gleamed under the sunrise, framed by green trees and willow branches that hung like ribbons across the water. The heaviness was gone. What remained was purity, as if nature itself had washed away the scars to leave only a beginning. Argo leapt down first paws, pressing firmly into damp earth, nose lifting to catch the scents of morning. Robert helped the girl out. She hesitated, her small hand clinging tightly to his, then released when Argo pressed his head against her side, nudging softly. A shy smile touched her lips, fragile, yet brighter than before. The three of them walked to the shoreline, once haunted by blades and blood, now filled only with the lapping of waves. Robert lowered himself onto the grass, eyes fixed on the mirror of water stretching before him. The girl sat close, knees hugged to her chest, watching a flock of birds cut through the sky. Argo lay at Robert's side, head resting against his leg, ears still alert, yet body at ease. For a moment they melted into one another, a man burdened by memory, a child just freed from darkness, and a shepherd returned from the forgotten. 3 lives, scarred in different ways, now woven together in the quiet warmth of belonging. Robert stroked Argo's back, feeling each breath rise and fall, each strand of fur shifting in the morning breeze. His heart whispered what his lips did not need to say. "Thank you for bringing us here." The girl turned to him, then to Argo, her voice soft. "I don't think this place is scary anymore." The words struck Robert deep. He looked into her clear eyes and saw the reflection of dawn, saw trust beginning to bloom. And he realized this journey hadn't just saved a child. It had saved him. And it had saved Argo, too, the loyal warrior. The sun climbed higher, gilding the lake in gold. 3 silhouettes, 1 man, 1 dog, 1 child, sat side by side, etched against the brilliance of morning. No vows spoken, no promises needed. Their presence alone was enough to light a rare kind of faith that from this day forward none of them would walk through darkness alone. In the hush of rippling water, Robert lifted his gaze, eyes distant, but softened. He knew life still held battles ahead, duties, losses, unspoken trials. But here with Argo and the girl beside him, he found a rare peace, a strength to carry forward. And in that silence, unvoiced yet undeniable, lingered a truth: the lake that once swallowed fear had become a keeper of light, proof that they had indeed come home. Night descended over the town like a thin blanket spread across rooftops. Golden light spilled from windows, softening the streets in warmth. Robert sat on the porch, a cup of tea steaming in his hand. In the small yard before him, Argo lay stretched out, head resting on his paws. His ears stayed pricked in old habit, but his gaze was calm, occasionally drifting to the half-closed door. Inside, the girl slept deeply, her breathing even. Safe, as though the cracks in her world had never been there. Robert gazed at Argo, and without warning, his heart swelled with emotions that words could hardly contain. Like an old reel of film, the very first memory returned, that freezing night outside the window of Harbor Lights, where a frail dog had stood, his ribs visible, his amber eyes burning like a fragile flame against the storm, glancing in, as though asking a single silent question. "May I sit and eat with you?" The question had never been spoken aloud, yet. It had echoed endlessly inside Robert, a quiet plea, a longing so simple and yet so piercing. That moment became the beginning of a journey that changed all of their lives, a path that saved not only a life, but bound together 3 hearts that had once felt adrift. From that gaze, Robert stepped out of his silence. Argo found meaning again, and the little girl discovered how to smile under the shelter of trust. Argo shifted gently, his golden brown eyes catching Robert's. They shone under the moonlight, no longer hollow, no longer filled with sorrow. What Robert saw was the brilliance of life itself, the quiet strength of a warrior returned from fire, the presence of a friend who had finally found home. In those eyes he saw loyalty that never faltered, courage that had raced through danger time and again, and tenderness powerful enough to soften pain. The wind rustled through the trees like whispers meant only for them. Robert sat still, letting peace settle around him. He knew the world outside was full of shadows yet to come, but the presence of Argo and the little girl gave him faith. Faith that loyalty and kindness always found their way back, even after ruin. Inside the house, resting on a small wooden table, lay a new collar. Etched upon it was the name Argo, and the words, "The light from the eyes." It was a reminder that the gaze outside that window had changed everything, rewriting the fate of a dog, a man, and a child. Robert lifted his hand to touch the scar along his arm, the scar left by a blade when he shielded the girl. It was no longer just a wound. It was proof that he had chosen to walk this path with Argo. A quiet smile appeared on his face as his eyes followed the dog's steady breaths. Their story closed in a perfect circle of feeling. From hunger in the cold to peace beneath the porch, every moment testified to the power of love, that even the smallest act of compassion could shine through the darkest night. Argo was no longer a stray wandering through shadows, but part of a family, a living symbol of courage and loyalty. That night Robert sat for a long time, letting the light in Argo's eyes illuminate his soul. It was not a blazing fire, not a dazzling glow, but a steady flame, eternal like a lantern that endures the longest night. And he understood that from this moment on, neither he nor the girl would ever walk alone. The light in Argo's eyes was the gentlest answer to that old unspoken question, "May I eat with you?" The answer had become more than a meal. It was a home, a place, a love that would never fade. The story of Robert Argo and the girl closed here, but its echoes lived on. A soft reminder that love always carries the power to change fate. From the moment Argo stood in the cold outside the window to the night he found his family, we understand that sometimes all it takes is a glance, a choice born of compassion to open an entirely new journey. German shepherds have long been known for their intelligence, loyalty, and courage. But above all, they carry hearts capable of silent devotion, of walking with humans through pain and into joy. Argo was more than a character. He became a symbol of resilience, of the strength kindness holds. He showed that even in the deepest darkness, there is always light within eyes that know how to love. Looking back on this journey, we are reminded of the value of cherishing animals, beings who offer love without condition. A small gesture, a hand extended, a meal shared, can rewrite the destiny of a life. And often their companionship becomes the very remedy our souls need. The final message of this story is a call to live with greater kindness, greater humanity. To learn loyalty and courage from Argo, to learn resolve from Robert, who chose compassion, and to learn hope from the girl whose smile returned after the shadows. Because love, in whatever form it takes, always carries the power to mend, to illuminate, and to make the world a warmer home for us all.